The first call didn't come from emergency services, it came from a daughter. Just after 1 a.m. on New Year's Day, in one of Switzerland's most exclusive ski resorts, a father looked out his window and saw an unnatural glow reflecting off the snow. Seconds later, his phone rang. What he heard next would pull him out of his home and straight toward a situation no parent ever expects to face. This isn't a story about headlines or numbers. It's about a few minutes where decisions mattered more than titles, and where being close enough and willing enough changed who made it out. And it all started less than 200 feet away. Paolo Campolo wasn't at the bar that night. He was at home in Crans, Montana, celebrating the arrival of the new year with his partner and a small group of friends. Like many families in the area, they were marking the moment quietly, unaware that next door, a popular gathering spot was filling with young people welcoming the same year in a very different way. Then Paolo noticed the light. From his window, flames were visible through the glass of a nearby venue known locally as a social hub for teenagers and young adults. Almost immediately, his phone rang. On the other end was his 17-year-old daughter, Paolina. According to Paolo's later account, her voice wasn't panicked and was stunned. She told him there had been a fire, that people were hurt, that something was very wrong. Paolo didn't wait for more information. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran outside. By the time he reached the building, the situation had already changed. The visible flames were beginning to die down, but the danger hadn't passed. Thick smoke surrounded the structure, and the air inside had become almost impossible to breathe. Fires like this don't always last long, but their aftermath can be just as dangerous. Inside, oxygen had been consumed rapidly, visibility was near zero, and people were still trapped. Paolo quickly realized the extinguisher wouldn't help. There was nothing left to put out. What mattered now was getting people out. Emergency crews were on their way, but in moments like these, minutes feel longer than they are. Paolo began looking for any possible exit, anything that wasn't the main entrance. That's when he found a door at the back of the building. It looked like an emergency or service exit. It opened outward, but it wouldn't move. Through the glass, he could see movement. Hands, feet, people on the ground. They were alive, but they were running out of time. Paolo wasn't alone anymore. Another man had arrived and immediately understood the problem without needing an explanation. There were no tools, no keys, no clear instructions, just a barrier between trapped teenagers and breathable air. They made a decision. Instead of the door, they turned to a nearby window. Using only their strength, they began forcing it open. According to Paolo, it wasn't clean or easy. They didn't know if it would work. But eventually, the glass gave way enough to create an opening. One by one, they began pulling people out. Many were disoriented, some were unconscious, others were crying, calling out in different languages. The people being rescued were very young, something Paolo would later say stayed with him more than anything else. They carried them away from the building to a safer area, then went back again and again. At some point during the chaos, Paolo saw his daughter outside. She was physically unharmed, but clearly in shock. She had been late arriving at the venue that night, a delay that, in hindsight, may have saved her life. Her boyfriend had escaped as well, though he was seriously injured and later hospitalized. Paolo didn't stop to process any of that in the moment. He kept going back toward the smoke. According to publicly available information, there were no other usable exits inside the venue. Those who couldn't reach the opening Paolo and the other man created had no clear way out. Eventually, firefighters took over. Medical teams began treating the injured. Paolo himself was later hospitalized due to smoke inhalation. His partner was also seriously hurt and required intensive medical care. In the days that followed, authorities announced that dozens of people had lost their lives, with many more injured. An investigation was opened into how the venue was managed and whether safety requirements had been met. But for Paolo, the questions came later. What stayed with him were the faces. The realization that the people he pulled through that window could just as easily have been his own children. And the understanding that the difference between tragedy and survival, that night, came down to who was close enough and who chose to act. In the aftermath, Paolo would describe the scene not in dramatic terms, but in practical ones. The fire itself, he said, was brief, intense, but short. What followed was more dangerous, a space filled with smoke, depleted of oxygen, where visibility collapsed in seconds. According to his account, many of the people inside never realized what was happening until it was already too late to react. There was no gradual escalation, no clear moment where the crowd understood the risk. 1 minute, it was a celebration. The next, the environment had become unlivable. This detail matters, because it explains why so many were caught off guard. Reports indicate that moments before the fire, celebratory effects were used inside the venue. Within seconds, the ceiling ignited, combustion spread rapidly, then stopped just as suddenly, leaving behind a sealed space filled with toxic smoke. For Paolo, standing outside, that silence was unsettling. Inside, there were no alarms he could hear, no organized movement toward exits, just stillness behind glass, interrupted by motion on the floor. People weren't trying to escape anymore, they were waiting, and waiting is what made every second critical. Paolo later explained that he didn't feel fear in that moment, not because the situation wasn't dangerous, but because there was no time to evaluate it emotionally. His focus narrowed to a single task: remove as many people as possible before the air inside became unsurvivable. He and the other civilian rescuer worked without coordination, without speaking much at all. One would pull someone through the opening, the other would move them away. Then they would switch. Some of those rescued were conscious but unable to stand. Others didn't respond immediately. Several were suffering from smoke inhalation and had to be placed on the ground until medical teams arrived. Despite the confusion, Paolo noticed something that stayed with him. Almost everyone was young. This venue, according to locals, was a common meeting place for teenagers in the area. Many of those inside were minors or just barely adults. As Paolo helped them out, he remembers noticing how they were dressed, not because it mattered, but because it emphasized how unprepared they were for what had just happened. They had come for a celebration, not an emergency. At one point, people who had already escaped began assisting as well, forming a loose chain to help move the injured farther from the building. No one was in charge. There was no plan, but there was cooperation. Eventually, professional responders took control of the scene. Firefighters secured the building. Medical teams triaged the injured. Those with severe injuries were transported to hospitals in nearby cities. Paolo was treated for smoke exposure and exhaustion. His partner, who had also rushed toward the scene earlier, sustained serious injuries and required ongoing care. In interviews given from his hospital bed, Paolo avoided presenting himself as a hero. He repeatedly emphasized that many people acted that night, and that the outcome could have been very different if the timing had shifted even slightly. He also acknowledged how close his own family had come to tragedy. His daughter had been delayed earlier that evening after returning from school in Geneva and stopping by his home before heading out. That delay meant she wasn't inside the venue when the fire broke out. Paolo described it as an impossible chain of coincidences, not luck, but timing that no one could have planned. Authorities later confirmed that a criminal investigation had been opened into the venue's management. According to official statements, investigators are examining whether safety regulations were followed and whether the lack of accessible exits contributed to the scale of the tragedy. Those proceedings are ongoing, but outside of courtrooms and reports, the impact of that night continues in quieter ways. For survivors, recovery is ongoing, physically for some, emotionally for many. For families, questions remain, and for Paolo, the memory of what he saw behind that locked door has not faded. In one of his final remarks to the press, he said something simple. He didn't talk about bravery, he didn't talk about instinct. He said only that when he heard the screams, he thought of his children, and that he couldn't walk away. That perspective reframes the entire event, not as an extraordinary act by an extraordinary person, but as an ordinary response to an unbearable situation. A reminder that in moments of crisis, proximity and responsibility can matter just as much as training. And it raises a larger question, not just about what happened that night, but about how such situations are prevented in the first place. In the days after the fire, attention naturally turned to investigations, procedures, and accountability. Those processes are important, and they take time. But long before any official conclusions are reached, the human reality of that night is already clear. A celebration became an emergency without warning. A familiar place turned unsafe in seconds. And the difference between who made it out and who didn't often came down to timing, access, and whether someone on the outside realized what was happening fast enough. Paolo Campolo didn't set out to intervene. He wasn't trained for it, and he didn't have equipment. What he had was proximity, awareness, and a reason he couldn't ignore a phone call from his daughter that reframed everything. His actions don't answer every question raised by this tragedy. They don't explain why exits were inaccessible, or why safety measures failed, or how a venue frequented by young people could become so dangerous so quickly. Those answers belong to investigators and regulators. But his experience does offer something else. It shows how fragile ordinary moments can be, how quickly environments we trust can change, and how, in rare but critical situations, individual decisions made in seconds can have lasting consequences for dozens of lives. For viewers trying to make sense of a story like this, the takeaway isn't fear, it's awareness, understanding how emergencies unfold, how quickly conditions can deteriorate, and why safety design and preparedness matter long before anything goes wrong. If there's a next chapter to this story, it isn't just about court outcomes or official reports. It's about what changes afterward and how venues operate, how risks are managed, and how seriously early warning signs are taken. And that leads to a larger question worth exploring next. How often do tragedies like this reveal problems that were invisible until it was too late, and what actually changes once the headlines fade?